So carrying on with this, still in part one, which is basically how do you fight a guerrilla war with a traditional force? And the answer that America had was high technology, very, very high technology. Arguably, this was the highest technology there was on the planet. Japan was not yet the industrial power that it is now, because remember, this is only roughly 20 years after World War II, and Japan was still in the manufacturing phase. They were working in everything, but they had not yet become the Asian tiger that they were going to be. So the world didn't look. You didn't go to Japan for technology. You didn't buy Sony. People didn't want to buy Japanese things anyway, because they fought the Japanese during World War II. So that's the enemy. Anyway, so out of the research and development world and out of the think tanks came some particular policies, which were adopted. They were also developed at the same time by the government. It's very hard now to go back and figure out, it's like, where exactly did some of these policies come from? But some of the most famous policies would include, for instance, the search and destroy policy. Search and destroy missions, later called sweep and clear, was that you went into a civilian hamlet and in rural Vietnam, which is, as I've said before, is a largely agrarian culture. It's farming, basically. And you look for enemies. And what you're looking for is there too much rice in a village? So you got a small village and they've got enough rice for, say, 100 people. You're like, hold on a second. You can't have that much rice. If you have that much rice, who are you feeding? Well, the argument is you're feeding an army. So when you find a rice cache or weapons cache, let's say, and there are no young men around, which there wouldn't be because they've all been taken away or they've all gone away to fight with the North Vietnamese or with the Viet Cong. So remember the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, or the Viet Cong, who are people in the South fighting against soldiers in the South and fighting against the Americans, right? Whoops, just say that. Okay, so you find a bunch of weapons and you're like, well, who's fighting with these weapons? So you don't just take the weapons or you don't just destroy the rice, put a grenade in the rice and destroy it, it's a war crime, basically, I think, to destroy a food source like that. But the idea is you're fighting an enemy. It's like you're fighting you don't want the enemy to survive. You don't want them to be able to be fed. So you destroy or burn a rice cache or a food cache. And then to indicate to the North Vietnamese that you're not fooling around, you burn the whole village down too, search and destroy. So you search for weapons, you search for caches of rice, search for spider holes, that is where people might hide and snipe on you. If, let's say, you're taking fire from the village, you keep getting guys killed or wounded, and you're like, there must be snipers there. Where are they? And you find a tunnel complex. You're like, okay, that's it. So you go in and you burn the village down using flamethrowers and doing what is called doing a Zippo raid. A Zippo raid means you use your Zippo lighter. You just hold the lighter to the thatch of the huts, basically, but the homes. And everything is made of dry, everything is made of tinder, basically. Everything is made of firewood, effectively. So the huts are made of bamboo and leaves and so on, so they can burn. So these are so-called Zippo raids, where people were told to go in and burn out the village. And then you have a whole bunch of Vietnamese who are used to living and have probably lived, that is, their people have probably lived on this land for maybe hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, believing as they do in ancestor worship, where the bones of the ancestors are sacred, where the land becomes sacred, then they're not going to want to leave. Well, what you do is remove them, and you move them to a village that you say no is safe, or you build a village and you force them into it. And so you basically take these refugees or evacuees, as they're called sometimes, depending on your politics, and you put them into hamlets that are protected. this was part of what was called the Strategic Hamlet Program. And Strategic Hamlets, the idea was to clear the Vietnamese out of an area that was you were uncertain whether it was friendly or not, and move them into a hamlet which you knew was yours and was protected and friendly. And that's the idea, save the Vietnamese. And then everything else outside the strategic hamlet is a free fire zone. You can kill anybody, anything. Those are the rules. There's rules that are being made up by the Americans as they go along. Let me note here the problem with using the word Viet Cong, which is supposed to be, I'm not fond of this word. We have to use it because it does describe a certain group of people. But it is supposed to be short for Vietnamese communist. But there are other accounts that it was a word that was created by the CIA for propaganda purposes. And sometimes they're just called the Cong. Overall, we're stuck with using Viet Cong or VC or Victor Charlie, Charles, Chuck, and so on, as I've talked about. In other words, there's a deep racism in the war and in the words we use to describe it. So I won't use these words again unless they appear in a written text that I'm reading from. But they are problematic, obviously, they're problematic. And just as insurgent and terrorist are deeply political and are politicized words as well. And so now I'm going to talk about the next couple of issues, old weapons and new weapons. So we'll stop here.